Canon Films Spider-Man. In the mid-1980s, Canon Films secured the rights to Spider-Man for a mere $225,000, plus a share of profits, with a 5-year window to produce a film. The Israeli cousins Menahem Golan and Yoram Globus, who ran the studio known for low-budget action and exploitation pictures, initially misunderstood the character completely. They commissioned Outer Limits creator Leslie Stevens to write a treatment that turned Peter Parker into a literal 8-armed human spider hybrid after a scientist named Dr. Zork deliberately irradiated him. The story leaned into body horror, with Peter battling other escaped laboratory mutants rather than traditional villains. Stan Lee hated it and forced a complete rethink. The revised version by Ted Newsom and John Brancato brought the story closer to the comics. A college-aged Peter Parker, whose mentor, Otto Octavius, becomes Dr. Octopus after a lab accident. Joseph Zito was attached to direct, with early casting ideas including a young Tom Cruise as Peter and Bob Hoskins as Doc Ock. Scott Leva, the real-life model who appeared in Spider-Man gear on a comic cover, was even considered. Sets were partially built, a teaser trailer was shot, and the budget was initially set around $20 million. Albert Puin later became involved when the budget collapsed, and there were talks of filming it back-to-back with a Masters of the Universe sequel to share costs and assets. The project collapsed because Canon was hemorrhaging money. Expensive flops like Masters of the Universe and Superman 4, The Quest for Peace, drained the studio. The Spider-Man budget was repeatedly slashed until it became unworkable. Creative talent walked away, the rights window closed without a film being made, and Canon's remaining assets and costumes were recycled into the Van Damme film Cyborg. By the late 1980s, the entire enterprise was finished, leaving only development costs and a handful of stills behind. Roger Corman's Spider-Man before Canon. Producer Roger Corman briefly held the Spider-Man film option in the early 1980s through Orion Pictures. Corman, famous for turning out profitable low-budget genre pictures at lightning speed, brought in Stan Lee himself to write a treatment. Lee's version stayed relatively faithful to the comics, but aimed higher than Corman's usual scale. Peter Parker was a college student facing Dr. Octopus. The climax featured a massive battle atop the United Nations building with extensive wall crawling, leaping, and swinging sequences. Lee also included multiple love interests, among them Mary Jane Watson and a Russian KGB agent, plus a Cold War subplot in which Spider-Man prevents nuclear conflict with the Soviet Union by defeating Doc Ock. The tone mixed adventure with the political tensions of the era, and Lee clearly wanted something closer to a major studio spectacle than a typical Corman quickie. The project never advanced beyond the treatment stage because of fundamental creative and financial disagreements. Lee wanted a big-budget production with ambitious set pieces. Corman specialized in making films for a fraction of that cost, and was unwilling or unable to stretch to the scale Lee envisioned. The rights eventually expired and moved on to Canon Films. Corman later produced the infamous unreleased 1994 Fantastic Four film under similar low-budget constraints, but his Spider-Man effort remained only a brief, unrealized footnote in the character's long path to the screen. James Cameron's Spider-Man, after Canon collapsed, the rights passed through a tangled series of deals and eventually landed with Carolco Pictures. James Cameron, coming off Terminator 2, developed an extensive scriptment for a darker, more mature Spider-Man. His version treated Peter Parker's transformation as an explicit metaphor for puberty and sexual awakening. Organic web shooters replaced mechanical ones. The story featured heavy profanity, violence, and a notorious sequence in which Peter and Mary Jane on the Brooklyn Bridge, after he explains spider mating habits and binds her with webbing. Electro and Sandman were the primary villains in the most detailed treatment, though earlier versions floated Dr. Octopus or the Lizard. Casting speculation included Leonardo DiCaprio as Peter and even Arnold Schwarzenegger in a supporting role. Cameron wanted a grounded, R-rated tone that leaned into psychological realism rather than pure comic book fantasy. Stan Lee publicly endorsed the project at the time, calling it potentially the greatest comic book film ever made. The movie died in a legal and financial nightmare. Carol Co. went bankrupt. The Spider-Man rights had been sold off in pieces to multiple companies for theatrical, home video, and television rights, triggering lawsuits and countersuits involving Golan, Carolco, Sony, Viacom, MGM, and Marvel. Cameron was also under exclusive contract to 20th Century Fox and could not freely pursue the project elsewhere. Fox refused to enter the rights battle. By the time the dust settled, Cameron had moved on to Titanic, and Sony eventually secured clean rights for Sam Raimi's 2002 film. Elements of Cameron's organic webbing and certain origin beats survived into later versions, but the darker, adult vision never reached cameras. Spider-Man 4. After the mixed to negative reception of Spider-Man 3 in 2007, Sam Raimi, Tobey Maguire, and Kirsten Dunst were still set to return for a fourth installment that Sony greenlit as both a course correction and a proper series closer. Raimi had been unhappy with how the third film turned out, feeling it was overcrowded with too many villains and forced subplots, and he saw Spider-Man 4 as the chance to restore the emotional heart and focus storytelling that defined the first two movies. Early development centered on stronger character relationships, particularly the strained romance between Peter Parker and Mary Jane Watson. While scaling back the excess, John Malkovich was cast as the Vulture, envisioned as a ruthless private military contractor whose brutality earned him the nickname because he left nothing but bones behind after his jobs. Anne Hathaway entered talks to play Felicia Hardy. At various points, the character was written as Black Cat, or a new creation called the Vulturess, a female counterpart who would serve as an apprentice or romantic foil tied to the Vulture. Dylan Baker's Kurt Connors, who had appeared in the previous two films as a one-armed scientist, was finally set to fully transform into the Lizard. Storyboards by longtime Raimi collaborator Jeffrey Henderson revealed large-scale action sequences, including aerial battles with the Vulture, and sequences that leaned into practical effects and Raimi's signature kinetic camera work. The overall tone aimed to end the trilogy on a high, emotionally satisfying note, rather than another overstuffed spectacle. The project collapsed in early 2010. Sony needed a Spider-Man film in active production to satisfy the terms of its rights agreement with Marvel, which required continuous development or the rights would revert. A hard May 2011 release date was locked in. Raimi went through multiple script drafts, working with writers including James Vanderbilt, but never found a version he fully believed in. Exhausted after years devoted exclusively to the franchise and still disappointed by Spider-Man 3, he told Sony he would rather walk away than deliver a film he considered less than great. The split was described by both sides as amicable and undramatic. Within days of the announcement, Sony pivoted to a complete reboot, launching The Amazing Spider-Man with Andrew Garfield and effectively ending the Maguire-Raimi era after 3 films. The Amazing Spider-Man 3 Sony locked in a June 10, 2016 release date for The Amazing Spider-Man 3 well before the second film even hit theaters, treating the Garfield Webb reboot as the foundation of a full shared universe. Mark Webb was attached to direct, with writers from The Amazing Spider-Man 2, Alex Kurtzman, Roberto Orci, and Jeff Pinkner handling early drafts. The story was designed as a direct continuation of the emotional fallout from Gwen Stacy's death. Peter Parker would be dealing with grief, guilt, and isolation, while Oscorp's remaining secrets continued to unravel. Chris Cooper's Norman Osborn was central. A deleted scene from the second film already showed his severed head being preserved in a cryogenic chamber. The third movie planned to revive him fully as a new Green Goblin, giving the character a second life and a more calculated, terrifying presence than his son Harry's unstable version. Michael Massey's Gustav Fiers, the Gentleman, would step out of the shadows as a major orchestrator, using his resources and knowledge of Peter's parents to manipulate events and recruit villains. Paul Giamatti's Rhino was confirmed to return. Additional ideas floated in development included a scientific serum capable of regenerating the dead, which could have brought back Captain George Stacy, or even a version of Gwen in some altered form. The film was also meant to lay heavier groundwork for the planned Sinister Six spin-off, with visual teases of chambers at Ravencroft Institute and potential appearances or mentions of Vulture, Dr. Octopus, and other classic foes. The project was cancelled in the wake of The Amazing Spider-Man 2's underwhelming critical reception and softer box office performance relative to its massive budget. The 2014 Sony Pictures hack exposed internal emails showing executive frustration with Andrew Garfield, particularly after he skipped a high-profile promotional appearance in Brazil meant to announce the third film alongside Sony CEO Kaz Hirai. At the same time, Marvel Studios approached Sony with a partnership offer that would place Spider-Man inside the MCU. Sony chose the cleaner, more commercially promising path, abandon the entire Amazing continuity, shelve both sequels and most spin-offs, and reboot once more with Tom Holland. The Amazing Spider-Man 4, a fourth film in the Amazing Spider-Man series, was tentatively scheduled for May 4, 2018, as the next step in Sony's original multi-picture expansion plan. It was conceived as a continuation of Andrew Garfield's arc after the events of the third movie, further exploring the lingering mysteries around Peter's parents, the full scope of Oscorp's experiments, and the growing threat of a coordinated villain team. Mark Webb had already indicated he would step back from directing and serve only as a consultant, opening the door for a new filmmaker to take the franchise forward while maintaining continuity. Early discussions suggested deeper involvement of the Sinister Six elements set up in the second and third films, potentially culminating in larger-scale confrontations that tied the solo movies to the planned spin-offs. Very little concrete plot was ever locked because the entire slate remained contingent on the critical and commercial success of The Amazing Spider-Man 3 and the surrounding universe films. Once Sony decided to partner with Marvel Studios and reboot Spider-Man inside the MCU, The Amazing Spider-Man 4 was cancelled alongside its predecessor. The underwhelming response to the second film, internal friction revealed by the Sony hack, and the clear commercial upside of joining the Avengers-driven universe made continuing the Garfield era unattractive. Both sequels, the Sinister Six movie, and most other planned spin-offs were wiped from the schedule in a single strategic shift, ending the Amazing Spider-Man continuity after only 2 theatrical releases. Michael Jackson's Spider-Man. In the late 1990s, while Marvel was financially struggling and the film rights were in flux, Michael Jackson approached Stan Lee about acquiring Spider-Man. Jackson was a longtime Marvel fan and specifically wanted to produce and star as Peter Parker. When Lee explained that he did not control the rights, Jackson escalated the idea and discussed purchasing the entire Marvel Comics company, potentially in partnership with Lee through Stan Lee Media. Nephew Taj Jackson later confirmed family conversations about the plan. The vision was never a fully developed screenplay, but a high-profile attempt by one of the world's biggest entertainers to own and embody the character on screen. The effort never progressed beyond discussions. Marvel's ownership structure, valuation demands, and internal complications blocked any deal. Jackson's own legal and personal controversies in the mid-1990s further complicated large-scale business moves. By the time Sony cleanly acquired the film rights, Jackson's window had closed. The idea remains one of the more surreal what-if chapters in Spider-Man's development history. Spider-Woman. In 2020, Sony announced that Olivia Wilde would direct and co-write a secret Marvel project, widely reported to center on Spider-Woman, most likely Jessica Drew. The character, created in the 1970s, possesses super strength, wall crawling, venom blasts, and pheromone powers, with a background involving experimental spider serum and later ties to S.H.I.E.L.D. and the Avengers. Wilde and writing partner Katie Silberman were developing the film under Amy Pascal's production banner as part of Sony's broader Spider-Man universe of spin-offs. Early rumors also mentioned possible involvement of other female spider characters. The project was positioned as a female-led entry distinct from Madame Web. It was cancelled in early 2026 after the commercial failures of Madam Web and Kraven the Hunter effectively ended Sony's standalone villain and side character universe. Industry reports confirmed the Spider-Woman film was dead, part of a wider decision to halt further non-Peter Parker live-action projects. Sony shifted focus toward its partnership with Marvel Studios for Tom Holland's films and select animated or television efforts, leaving the Jessica Drew movie among the many unrealized spin-offs.